indeed watching Breakthrough News, and this is the Freedom Side Live. I am one of your hosts, Eugene Puryear, here as always, alongside my intrepid co-host, Rania Khalek. Rania, it feels like you're preparing to do something, but good to be alongside you here.
Well, Eugene, I am alongside you. However, we don't have the wide shot. So in order to prove that I'm alongside you, me and Eugene are sitting right next to each other.
Yep.
I'm just going to very quickly,
Oh, look at that.
Hello, it's my hand.
They don't know. That could also be CGI. Woo! So there's really no way to know. This is 2023. We got ChatGPT.
Same nails. What are the odds that there would just be someone's random hand?
I mean, we had a week to prepare.
Could you imagine if we went that far where we had the exact same nail color?
I absolutely could imagine
shape,
if we went that
got a hand
far.
model to match my hand.
That's how we do things.
So
we're not cutting any corners here at Breakthrough News. So I would anything less would honestly be a big disappointment. But either way, we are here. We are alongside each other. We were in the same room last week, so here we really are.
We were, but we were like across from each other because we had like a little bit of a technical issue that we've now fixed. But I just wanted to prove that we are indeed in the same room in person. Very excited about that. Go ahead, take it away, Eugene. I've said my piece.
Thank you. Well,
that's all I'm here to say.
Well, someone needed to say it. But of course, all of you are watching us on YouTube. Happy to be back with you wherever you may be enjoying the show. But this would also be a good time to remind you, if you are not already, to go ahead and hit subscribe so that you can get everything from our channel, and make sure you hit the bell so you get the alerts to everything that you have subscribed to, including Dispatches with Rania Khalek. Just want to remind you, excellent interview with investigative journalist Seymour Hersh about the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, among many other things, released recently by Rania and our Breakthrough News team here. And of course, this would also be a good time for you to let anyone who is following you know that we are on, so that they can be following us. I don't know if you want to send a text message, yell across the hall, honk your horn, although I really hope you are not watching while driving. But, if you're parked, perhaps you can alert those in the parking lot with you. But drive safely, everyone. But whatever it takes, carrier pigeon, phone call, something that's relevant, let them know, because we've got a great show. As always, all around the world, from Atlanta to China to America, all around, in terms of how the NSA is spying on you, the Nord Stream 2 crisis, censorship on YouTube. Hopefully that doesn't get us censored. And also warmongering think tankers and how they are tied to the military-industrial complex. So we've got plenty for you here, plenty that I think anyone who would like to see and hear. Rania, anything else you want to add?
Yeah, I think one of the most important ways that you can also support our excellent work here at Breakthrough News, on top of course, shouting, what did you say, down a hallway?
Well, shouting in the hallway.
In the hallway, or like alerting
Knocking
people by
your
honking your
door.
horn. Those are all very welcome ways to support the show. You can also become a patron at patreon.com/breakthrough news. And on top of that, you can donate directly in the live chat if you so choose. If you just want to do a one-time donation, any donation from our viewers is, of course, always deeply we're always deeply grateful for that.
Yes, no, absolutely. We need your support to keep going, and we thank you for that. So patreon.com/breakthrough news. But now we want to turn to our first story of the evening, and that is the 2 sessions in China, the principal legislative meeting there in that country. And we are very honored to be joined once again here by Tings Chok, who is a researcher at the Tricontinental Institute and a member of the Dongsheng News Collective, which, by the way, just released a great new podcast series. Tings, thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you, Rania. Thank you, Eugene.
Well, it's always a pleasure to have you with us. And, obviously, of course, almost many things that happen in China are to some degree big news here in the U.S., but always very decontextualized. So there's a lot about the 2 sessions in the most general sense in the media. But where I wanted to start here, first and foremost, is what are the 2 sessions and where do they fit in the legislative process of China?
Yeah, I think it's good to start at the basics, because the 2 sessions, it has an interesting name. It's these back-to-back meetings that help set the direction for the country and for the year. And this is a particularly important one because it's following the 20th National Congress at the end of last year. And so the leaders of the state bodies will actually get elected, including presidency and vice presidents, into the government, right? And the 2 sessions are 2 important political bodies. The first is what's called the National People's Congress, around 2,900 candidates. And these are actually elected bodies from the grassroots level all the way up to the national level. And their role is really to oversee how the government functions, whether it's about enacting or amending or supervising the implementation of laws or regulations, the election or dismissal of government officials, reviewing, the government processes, etc. And I think one thing that people often don't know is actually at the lowest levels, these deputies are actually elected by vote from the grassroots level. And then the other part is something that's a very interesting, I think, characteristic that was established after the revolution in 1949, which is the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference. Very, very long name. People always like CPPCC. But anyways, this is a large body for consultative, and it's an advisory body. And interestingly, I just want to point out is that this is mostly non-CPC members. So this is really a place where the other 8 parties that exist in China, mass organizations representing women, workers, youth, but also industry, different sectors of society, ethnic minority groups, and other sort of invited individuals get to provide advice, basically. This is the advisory body. So they're really 2 pillars of China's unique political system, but I won't go on too much about it. Dongsheng actually just released a monthly publication, and the first explainer we did is on this 2 sessions, so people can check that out. And there's also a video we just launched today.
Yeah, everybody should definitely be getting their news about China from Dongsheng News Collective, which, of course, Tings, you're a part of. One of the big topics that was dominating Western media throughout the week because of these 2 sessions was Xi Jinping's speech, where he responded directly to this growing U.S.-China tension. And this is being portrayed in the U.S. media, at least, as a more aggressive shift by China. Actually, I think that wasn't even just in the U.S. press. That was sort of the general take around the world, because typically you don't hear this kind of rhetoric from Chinese leaders. So how do you evaluate that framing?
I mean, I think it's quite interesting because maybe it's like the arrogance or hubris of U.S. hegemony is that it thinks it's at the center of everything, including the most important annual political event of the second largest economy in the world, or the 2 sessions, but just isn't. So, she made some comments about the U.S., but it was actually a very small part of his actual speech and intervention, because ultimately it's around the future of the country and it's not just about the U.S. But that being said, in terms of looking at that shifting tone towards the U.S. over time, I mean, and I know that aggression has been used often to describe the Chinese diplomatic voice. We are seeing a shift, but I think the aggression that we're seeing and sort of the responses to real aggression, the escalating provocations by the U.S., be it the sanctions, the trade war, media war, the escalations regarding Taiwan, and up to most recently, using F-16 to, fire a missile to take down a balloon. Not to speak of the aggressions towards the rest, the countries and peoples and sovereign nations. That being said, there has been, I think, a stronger tone from the Chinese side, not just now during the 2 sessions. We remember the Alaska meeting between Anthony Blinken and Yang Jiechi, who's no longer in that post, but strong words were exchanged. We have Wang Yi, China's top foreign affairs diplomat, who actually responded after just a couple of weeks ago after the balloon incident, using really strong words around it being absurd and hysterical. So we're seeing, I think, a stepping up of that tone. But I would like to, I guess, emphasize where the aggression is coming from. And for many people here, it's understanding it's about time we have a more, let's say, defensive posture and a strong posture on the diplomatic stage. But I think one thing I want to mention is that I guess Wang Yi, the Chinese diplomat, was saying that, the balloon incident and amongst other things, and maybe this focus on the words that she has used in this 2 sessions is a bit of a political farce. It's a bit of a smoke screen against the real issues that, of course, the Western media will never talk about. I mean, the real content of the 2 sessions, what is the future of the socialist development? What is China thinking around tech and finance and, the needs of the country and how it's positioning itself in the world. So those things, unfortunately, never get to be reported.
Well, I'm glad you bring that up because one of the things that, has been highlighted certainly in the state media there and in certainly the specialist media are, some of the reforms that are happening around the financial industry, which, is one of the biggest topics. Certainly if you read the Wall Street Journal on a regular basis, also the New York Times, there's always about to be some massive, financial collapse in China. Somehow it never materializes the way they say, but they're always saying that there's something, some hidden bomb and said this or that market or whatever it may be. So I was hoping you could talk a little bit more about that because it did seem like that was something that China was also trying to message to the world is a major change they're looking to make in the next year or so.
Yeah, we've seen some significant sort of reshufflings or regulations in how the economy specifically, but all the sectors as well, will be organized. And I think you're rightly to point out, why sometimes the West is really focused on the impending doom of the country, but it's not to say everything is all rosy here. Coming out of the 3 years of the pandemic, there's been many things around risks in the financial sector that these reforms are trying to address. Specifically, I'll give one example is around the real estate industry. And because you just mentioned about the impending doom, remembering Evergrande, which is one of the largest real estate developers that racked up a $300 billion debt at the end of 2021. And so there has been a question of real estate and how this is going to affect the rest of the economy, because real estate is huge in China. It's 13% of the GDP. It's a third of the economic growth of the country and really the basis of the local government revenue. So right now, despite the fact that it didn't become a Lehman Brothers, didn't collapse, the 2008 did not happen here as much as the Western pundits wanted to see, Beijing has been ramping up some efforts on this area. So first was these 3 red lines, trying to limit borrowing policies of developers, but also bringing in interesting measures like, getting state-backed companies to buy assets from Evergrande, or getting, for example, 10 local governments together to manage the revenue and manage the money flow of a private company to be able to ensure that, houses are being delivered to the home buyers. And I think that's one of the things that people don't get to understand is that under a social system, even with a mixed economy, there are a whole set of mechanisms and tools, both economic and political, and not just the market itself, that aren't available in a capitalist society, of how to avert and reel in some of the challenges of the private sector or the financial sector. And what we're seeing with some of these oversight bodies that have been created to manage these risks in these 2 sessions will help with some of the things that have already been in place over the last few years, help to, control rent prices, or curtail the financialization of the sector, or affirm really, one of the big things is around the houses are for living in and not for speculation, which the government has been really pushing for, looking at this financial risk posed by real estate. But that being said, there's been other areas that are quite interesting too, strengthening or kind of restructuring some of the science and technology ministries, knowing that tech is very much at the center of this new Cold War, the kind of, look at the U.S. So-called containment strategy, looking at semiconductors, AI, biotech. So a lot of that restructuring is also happening here to kind of more align some of these ministries' work with more strategic interests of the country and responding to the conjunctural and geopolitical reality we've been living in.
One thing about this entire process is the way that it's presented is it's like as if it's like just this sort of rubber stamp fake legislator. But in reality, what you're talking about actually seems part of this kind of deeper democratic process in China. Do you think that's fair to say?
Yeah, I think because our understanding of democracy, like let's say the general common sense, is framed around the Western liberal democracies, believing that the voting at the ballot box between every 4 or 5 years between this party or that one is somehow less of a rubber stamp and more representative of the people's will and aspirations. But I guess it just can't, that's just not the only model that exists. And we have lots of reason to believe that model also is not the only thing that works or even is working. But I think it's also a narrow view to think that, all of this, is just a political farce. It's a way to really consolidate the personal political power of one man over, 1.4 billion people. And it's just not a possibility. China is such a complex society. It's such a large territory, so diverse with so many people. You can't build, a country up until the second largest economy by coercion alone. You need a huge amount of participation at different levels. And in order to even pass a single law, to enact it, to make it happen, 1.4 billion people, I think sometimes it's hard to conceive of how big a country this is and how complex it is to govern. But I'll give one concrete example of how something will actually get passed or kind of brought to these two sessions. So, for example, 2 years ago was the enactment of China's first comprehensive civil code. There's an accumulation over decades of trying to, reform the civil sector of China's regulatory system. We have to remember that China, actually, the PRC is very young. It's 70 years old. So all of this is still in the process of, being built. So before that civil code, which has like 1,200 articles on everything from property law to marriage law, inheritance, rights around the internet and other things like that, you actually had a process of 4 or 5 years where huge amounts of public opinion were being solicited. So this will actually happen, getting maybe thousands of opinions from the grassroots level throughout the National People's Congress system. But then there will be online consultations, in-person consultations. I mean, that a civil code alone got over 1 million general members of the public opinion on these different sectors of this one civil code. And I think this is the lead up, I think, about 4 or 5 years before it actually even gets brought into the National People's Congress meeting, this annual meeting, and voted and passed on. So it's not possible that one person just with an iron fist can be able to develop even pass one legislation like this. It requires literally millions of people participating to be able to build the consensus, let's say, and also build the sort of the political will to be able to enact it. And that's the thing that people don't see. And they see it's a rubber stamp. People show up in their suits, or whatever else once a year. And then, just, okay, done and dusted. That's our job done. But it's all the work and the lead up and the participation that are required because China is a highly consensus-based society still.
No, I think really good points. And, it's worth noting for people who are watching that almost every study that's ever done asking people in China and people in America who, if they think their country's a democracy, there was one last year, 83% of Chinese people thought they live in a democracy, 49% of Americans. So that in and of itself, I think, should tell you something. But given these wide disparities, we've mentioned it a couple times, but where can people find the Dongsheng News Collective, Tings, if they want to keep following China more closely?
Yeah, absolutely. You can find us at Dongsheng News, DONGSHENG, news, basically on all the social media platforms. So check us out and find our website.
Right on. Tings Chok, researcher at the Tricontinental Institute and member of the Dongsheng News Collective. Thank you once again for giving us some of your valuable time here on the Freedom Side.
Thank you.
Also, just want to shout out Lavender Eucalyptus made a donation while that was going on. Many thanks to you. Always very happy to have Tings on. I have no idea what time it is in China, but I know it's very, very early or very, very late, however you look at that. So I always appreciate folks in China, India, all over, South Africa who stay up very late to bring you the important analysis live from those various countries.
You never thank me when I'm in Lebanon.
Well, I mean, you're required to be here. So,
and I wouldn't rather be anywhere else.
Thank you.
I'm just saying, every once in a while, it'd be nice to recognize the times I'm on.
I believe me. Okay. To the audience, thank you, Rania.
Thank you. That's all I wanted. Yes. Can we get like a GIF of that, but with sound? Just thank you, Rania.
I think we can clip that.
Thank you, Rania.
I think the team can clip that for sure. Well, I appreciate that. But yeah, no, I mean, I think an important issue, and obviously, there's very little significant coverage of what's really going on there in China. But we're told that we should be ready to go to war with them, up into and including nuclear war. But, most people are extraordinarily, I don't even want to say misinformed, probably uninformed, because, all you get is doom, gloom, negativity, never anything positive, never anything in a positive light. I mean, it's one of the things I note. I always feel like about any country. I mean, obviously you can always say bad things about any country, but I'm always just astounded by the fact that you can't find good things, even though you have 1,000 American reporters living in the country. But anyway, that's a whole other story. We want to move to a whole other story on our side, an ongoing story, I have to say, and that is the ongoing protests in the city of Atlanta, Georgia, by those in the area who are outraged at this Cop City, a $90 million training platform that the Atlanta city government is trying to build there for police in Atlanta, and I think around the world would be coming to it. And we are really, really honored to be joined by Kiana Jones, who's a community organizer in Atlanta. Kiana, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
Well, the pleasure is all ours. And of course, we're still in the week of action around Cop City. I think people around the country have probably seen something about this at this point, primarily because these domestic terrorism charges that a number of people have been arrested on. But it really does seem like the city of Atlanta and the state of Georgia is willing to go to any length to build this Cop City, no matter what it costs the people.
They do seem intent on building Cop City no matter what, but just as intent as they are in building Cop City, we are intent on standing against it. Cop City represents nothing good for our community. It represents over militarization and repression of the people of the city of Atlanta, Georgia, and the nation, to be exact, because when you have something like Cop City, it becomes a model for other locations.
Just real quick I know this is a relatively big story in the U.S. right now, particularly on the left and those who care about police reform and police brutality. But could you just very briefly remind our listeners and viewers what exactly is Cop City and why is it so problematic?
So we have named it Cop City because it is a so-called public safety training facility that would not only be a place for law enforcement to train, but also there would be a complex that is dedicated to firefighters and first responders. However, the majority of that complex would be used to build a mock city where urban warfare training would take place, complete with bomb testing facilities. There would even be a landing pad for a Black Hawk helicopter, and there would even be a bar for the cops to go after they've done all of this intensive training. So we have coined the term Cop City because it's pretty much a small city for the cops within the city of Atlanta. And it is problematic because, first of all, the place that they decided to place this so-called training facility is in one of the blackest neighborhoods in the city of Atlanta that was underrepresented and underfunded for a very long time. This particular part of the city of Atlanta also lies within the unincorporated DeKalb County. So that is another issue as far as jurisdiction. What right does the city of Atlanta even have to build this in a place where there was a deed to the county of DeKalb that said that that particular tract of land should be for the people of DeKalb County for public land in perpetuity. There's actually a lawsuit going on surrounding the South River watershed, which is also located there, and the entrenchment creek. There was a stop work order put in place, and the city of Atlanta allowed APF to go ahead with building anyways. So we have quite a few issues going on surrounding this supposed public training facility, but none of them have good implications for the community there.
Well, I'm really glad you brought up the Atlanta Police Foundation. And I think, in every city in America, these police foundations don't get a lot of focus on them. And I was hoping you could talk a little bit more about their role and some of the corporations that are involved, because I think it puts, an interesting angle on what's happening with this development.
When people understand that the corporations who support the Atlanta Police Foundations are doing a lot of double talk. They will donate to initiatives that are supposedly in favor of diversity, equity, and inclusion, but then on the back end, they join APF. And these corporations include Home Depot, the Atlanta Hawks Foundation, Chick-fil-A, the Waffle House, Delta, Georgia Pacific.
Wow.
There's even a professor at Georgia State University who is a member of the Atlanta Police Foundation. And then you also have Invest Atlanta, where Mayor Andre Dickens is the chair of the board. And Invest Atlanta is a government entity of the city of Atlanta whose mission statement says that it's their goal to increase economic opportunity for all Atlantans and to foster economic equity. Something like Cop City would do the exact opposite of what that mission statement says. So when we think about the Atlanta Police Foundation and we think about what they're doing with building Cop City and we look at the money behind them, we have to begin to take a look at how we spend our money and decide that we are not going to fund our own oppression.
Well said. And of course, there has been a lot of pushback against Cop City, as you all have named it, including protests. And we see that something like 35 activists have actually been arrested for opposing Cop City. One of them includes a legal observer. And of course, the craziest part is some of them are being charged with domestic terrorism. Can you talk a bit about the pushback in the community and then, of course, the police response?
Yes, I definitely believe that charging protesters with domestic terrorism, number one, I think is very telling of the posture of not only the mayor of the city of Atlanta, but also the Atlanta Police Foundation and these law enforcement agencies that have come together as a part of the task force that surrounds Cop City. You have representatives from the Atlanta Police Department, Georgia State Police, the GBI, Georgia State Troopers. You have everyone except for MARTA Police involved in staking out, we say, the area where Cop City is looking to be built. And charging protesters with domestic terrorism is a really dangerous thing because when you talk about something like terrorism, the word terrorist invokes in your mind people like Osama bin Laden, who had a mission to literally destroy democracy in the United States. When you say terrorism, you think about Al Qaeda. You don't think about people on the street holding a sign being charged with terrorism simply because we have decided to disagree with the powers that be. I think this sets a very dangerous precedent because now you are stifling democracy. You are not only infringing upon people's First Amendment rights to speak out, but you're also saying that if I disagree with you, then there's an issue and I'm going to lock you up. That is reminiscent of governments that the United States has historically fought against. That is reminiscent of the types of things, the types of oppression that the United States has historically claimed to stand against. So when you begin to do this to your own citizens, simply because they disagree with something that you have decided to do, you are telling the citizens that you represent that you truly don't care about their voices and that you are not a representative of their idea of democracy.
Yeah, I mean, some of the things that we've seen, I saw that they sent a SWAT team to break up people handing out flyers. I mean, it really does seem that so much of this is, or maybe just even in a deeper sense, I mean, it feels that Atlanta, that Georgia is becoming such a ground zero around this issue of democracy, around the right to vote. I mean, I can't remember exactly who it was, but the state representative who was arrested for just trying to, stand up when Governor Kemp was signing in the bill for these, laws to take away people's right to vote. I mean, this really does feel part and parcel in a way. And I think the point you're making is very true about, what can happen around the rest of the country, that a lot of the things happening right now in Atlanta and in Georgia centered on Atlanta really do seem to be ground zero in a conversation of A, what is democracy, and B, whether or not we're going to have it in the U.S.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That is the sentiment among people who have decided to speak out against Cop City and to stand. And what the city of Atlanta needs to understand, what the state of Georgia needs to understand, what anyone around the world needs to understand is that people are not going to sit idly by and let you do them dirty. People are not going to sit idly by and say, hey, take away my green space, take away this park where my family and I go biking, take away the watershed that's an important resource in my community and intricate to the water system here. Hey, take away my clean air and test bombs down the street from my child's school. There are two schools right near the location where they are proposing to build Cop City. What do you think children will think and how will they feel when they hear the bombs being tested? What are they going to think when the Black Hawk helicopters are landing and it's so close to where they're having PE? What are they going to think when they hear the gunfire from practicing of urban warfare? That's not something that we want our children exposed to. But I think that what Cop City shows more than anything is the relationship between the haves and the have-nots. Because we know here in the city of Atlanta that Cop City has become the compromise for the fact that the city of Atlanta would not allow Buckhead to secede from Atlanta. So that silent agreement that's been maintained for so long between the infrastructure of government and the so-called Black elite here in Atlanta is being perpetuated by Cop City because East Atlanta, right where they are proposing to build the facility, right behind my house, right down the street from my grandmother's house, that neighborhood was a Black community that is now being galvanized by gentrification. And that end of East Atlanta, where Cop City is proposing to be built, is not quite there where the rest of East Atlanta Village is. So there are still quite a few Black families there. But if gentrification continues and Cop City is built, then those families are going to be pushed out. But then in the 20 to 30 year cycle of gentrification, we know that Black families will be right back in that community in 20 to 30 years. So Cop City is the answer for those families that when they get there, they better stay right there because Buckhead is off limits. Black families, poor families, any undesirables are not welcome in Buckhead. And Cop City is being put there to make sure that they don't get there.
I'm curious, given the amount of pushback and the amount of opposition there is in Atlanta among just the various communities who are going to be affected, is there any opposition coming from local representation? I mean, obviously the mayor has a position, but what about are there local city councils, just local politicians, local leaders who are taking the side of the community on this?
Everyone seems to be afraid except Liliana Bakhtiari, who is the city council member that represents that district where they want to build Cop City. Not only has she been silenced to a degree, but she has brought forth some very pertinent questions. She has asked for answers for the community. She's not gotten them. She has also stood up and at one point even introduced a resolution against it. But of course it failed because she does not have the support of other city council members. There are some other city council members who just won't take a position because it was introduced before they got into office. They are still finding their way. They are new and they are quite frankly torn between, do I stand up for this community or do I follow my political ambitions and make sure that I can stay in good standing with these people who can advance my political career? Right now, what I see is a lot of political posturing and people just going along to get along, not wanting to stand for the people because they know that they are truly not of the people. And I think that this in and of itself should be a wake-up call to the city of Atlanta for the people who they elect to represent them when they think about what's going to be good for them and for their families. Look at the faces of these people who won't stand up for you against police repression. The faces of people who won't stand up for you against environmental injustice, because that's what the building of this facility is, environmental injustice. When you look at those people, remember their names, remember their faces, and don't ever vote for them again.
Mm-hmm. You know, one of the things that I think a lot of folks are wondering around the country, maybe probably around the world too, is what they can do to help, to assist, to raise the alarm. Because obviously, I think, similar to so many things we've seen from Standing Rock to Ferguson to Minneapolis, we know that it's not just the one city.
Absolutely. Like I said before, these things become models for the rest of the nation and then the rest of the world. So wherever you are, if you want to help, in the fight to stop Cop City. You can definitely follow the hashtag Stop Cop City. You can follow Defend the Atlanta Forest on the website, that is defendtheatlantaforest.org. There is a media toolkit where you can begin to post on social media. It has a lot of facts, a lot of information. There is even the lawsuit that has been filed in relation to this case so that people can better inform themselves. I would encourage people to go to communitymovementbuilders.com. On their page also is a lot of information about Cop City, and people can understand better why we say that this is over militarization and repression of Black communities here in Georgia. What I would also encourage people to do is to be mindful and be watchful in their own communities. Pay attention to what's going on in your local city council, at your local county board of commissioners, even at your school board, because many of these things start at levels that low. Pay attention to what's going on. Be informed and be civically engaged. Get your neighbors involved. And most of all, don't be afraid to use your voice to speak up. Community voice is so important, and democracy would not work if we didn't have community voice. Don't let anyone silence you. Always stand up for your community and always fight for what you know is right.
Right on. Kiana Jones, community organizer in the city of Atlanta, Georgia. Thanks so much for joining us here on the Freedom Side.
Thank you.
Well, major issue. Another thing that, should be noted here is the old outside agitators trope is being rolled out by the mayor and the governor there.
Gotta love it.
Martin Luther King Jr., the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.,
Ultimate
prominent
agitator.
Atlantan. Yeah, he and spoke out very much against it. They always called him an outside agitator. So I'd like to hear the senior pastor at Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta, that's the senator, Reverend Raphael Warnock, speak out about this. He's also been silent. Very disappointing for someone who tries to claim that legacy, but not that surprising, unfortunately. But hopefully folks go to defendtheatlantaforest.org and find a way to raise their voice against these potential 38-year domestic terrorism charges being levied on dozens of protesters. Many of them have absolutely not many, all of them. It's completely ridiculous. So you'll see if you look into it. Well, we want to move here to another issue that is critical from the point of view of civil liberties, so connecting to issues and also here in the United States, and that is the ongoing authorization of government surveillance on Americans. And they say it's on people in other countries, but nonetheless, the reauthorization of Section 702 of the FISA Act. And we are very, very honored to be joined as we continue the show here by Kevin Gostelow, who's the managing editor of Shadowproof.com, the curator of the Dissenter.org newsletter, and the co-host, I wonder who his other host is, of the podcast Unauthorized Disclosure.
It's me, guys. I'm the other host of that show.
Kevin, welcome
Spoiler
back.
alert.
Well, Kevin, thanks so much for joining us. As always, I really appreciate it. And maybe just to frame the conversation, some people probably saw the sort of flurry of news articles that came out in the beginning of the week that there's a push to reauthorize Section 702. But what is Section 702?
Yeah, so this is a section of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act that we all learned a whole lot about thanks to NSA whistleblower Edward Snowden and the many documents that he disclosed. And when we're talking about 702, we're talking about programs like the Upstream Surveillance Program, which basically means that the agencies of our government or the intelligence agencies of our government would have the ability to get the communications from the internet backbone. So these are like the fiber optics cables that run and connect us all around the world. And then there's the downstream surveillance. And the downstream surveillance is what people might know as the PRISM program. I don't know if they call it that anymore, but when Edward Snowden exposed it, this was the way in which the NSA could get communications from, let's say, Facebook or Google or Yahoo or companies of that nature. So when we're talking about this, we're basically describing how the FBI or any other agency that wanted to use the database of communications can basically put in a selector, and they can go through and do a search, and they're able to use this communications for basically any purpose. Yes, they do have to go before the court and put in a request. But there's also a way in which they can do something called backdoor searches. And backdoor searches allow them to just search the already existing information that's been collected in this database without going to get a warrant for that information. So this is we're talking about a tool that is available to the U.S. surveillance state that we know has been abused, that we know has only been modestly reformed. It's been heavily documented. Even the very agencies or institutions that do the little oversight over this process have shown that there's constantly mistakes. I'll put those in quotes. I don't know if they're really mistakes, but usually you see that the agents who are involved don't understand this. They're going too far. They're using this information in ways that are improper, but there's really no push until someone is targeted inappropriately to do anything about it.
And of course, now that you have the reauthorization coming up, is there any official pushback? We have this group in Congress called the Squad. I'm not saying this to be ooh, let's go after them. I actually don't know. That's why I'm asking you. Is anyone in the Progressive Caucus pushing back against this? I know there's also some people on the right in Congress who've tried to fashion themselves as being very libertarian. So I assume there might be a couple of members of Congress in the libertarian camp who are hopefully against this. So yeah, what do we as American citizens have to look forward to in terms of anybody out there in a position of power protecting us from this sort of spying?
Well, as far as Congress goes, it's worth noting that there was a Republican congressperson, his last name's LaHood, who's from Illinois, who wound up being the target of an inappropriate search in this. But what's fascinating is he says that he would still like to see Section 702 or this authority reauthorized. So it solidifies, he's a Republican. It solidifies my belief that these Republicans who oppose mass surveillance simply just don't think they should ever be the victim or the target. But everyone else can be targets of our surveillance apparatus, and that would be okay for them going forward. I don't know how much we're going to see from progressives, certainly with Biden and the White House coming out in support of reauthorizing Section 702. I think we're going to be very fortunate if we even see a little bit of tinkering with it that takes care of some of the issues. We saw a statement come out from Jake Sullivan, of all people. He's the national, he's frequently involved in national security affairs for the Biden White House when he's not plotting to start World War III or,
blowing up pipelines,
engaged in helping to facilitate the censorship industrial complex on our social media. He says that they need this in particular because it helps them fight the war in Ukraine. It helps them counter China. It helps them challenge North Korea, Iran. They say that they need this tool in order to fight cyber attacks, to deal with ransomware threats. So that's why the Attorney General, that's why the person who is in the position that James Clapper used to hold, the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, that's why they believe that we have to continue this. And with those institutions saying that they want this authority to continue, with it being that Biden is in office, we have a Democrat. We don't usually see progressives challenge a Democratic president. There really wasn't any challenge when it came to these excesses under Obama. I don't think without Edward Snowden we would have ever seen any kind of push to deal with the mass surveillance that was exposed. And so I don't think it looks very good. I don't treat the Republicans as good faith actors when they challenge what the government is doing with surveillance, but they probably will be the most vocal opponents of reauthorizing 702, which will mean that there will be a lot of pressure from progressives and people, I think, on the left to say, well, I don't really trust you. And they're not probably going to join in the struggle to prevent this reauthorization.
Yeah, no, it's interesting and very much a tinge of the election over the Republican response here. I know Ron Wyden, a Democrat from Oregon, has tried to put this on, but yeah, it seems like a lot of tinkering, and I mean, and that to some degree feels important to me, Kevin. In looking at this, is that they might try. It feels like each time this comes up now, they try to say, well, we've added some new guardrail, and then it turns out that whatever that was also did not work. It's been going on and on and on and on, and I think people don't even fully understand the nature of this process. I mean, there is this sort of FISA court, but I think when most people think of court, they think like, oh, they have a lawyer, I have a lawyer, but there's no adversarial process whatsoever. I mean, there are many negative things and hypocrisies around the sort of quote unquote American democracy, but I think sometimes it really kind of flies under the radar how this is just squarely outside of what I think most people's sort of popular conception of a democratic process would be, despite the claims.
Yeah, it's important for people to understand that as far as oversight, we really don't have much of anything that prevents the FBI and these other agencies from abusing the surveillance authority that has been given to them. And anytime groups try, there just was a Supreme Court decision. They refused to hear the ACLU's case that was brought on behalf of Wikimedia Foundation, which was an effort to challenge this very thing that we are discussing on this show right now. And they said basically the government can invoke the state secrets privilege, and they're not allowed to challenge the way in which this surveillance is carried out against people. And in that, there were organizations that represent journalists. There's been a case before that has represented human rights advocates, but in this case, people were raising the chilling effect on journalism because this could target your sources. This can be a means, especially if you engage in international journalism or you're a foreign correspondent, they can go after your sources and collect those communications because they have this very broad term. They say they want to collect foreign intelligence information or any information about foreign affairs. And if what you're doing falls into that category, then they can intercept it. So hypothetically, anything that you were doing on a foreign government, or you could target entrepreneurs. So people who do business in China could be targeted. People who want to do business with, I guess, trade partners that are not cooperating with U.S. capitalism, those individuals, they could find themselves on the wrong side of the equation, being targets. And so I think this is a really troubling thing because we do not have a mechanism for making sure that this isn't abused. And the one last project that I'll mention is when Ron Wyden was questioning the FBI director, Christopher Wray, this past week, we learned that there was a pilot project earlier where they were purchasing people's data, that the FBI had actually gone to like a data broker and purchased data that could facilitate their investigations. And he said it was a pilot project. But what's baffling to me is even though they're not adopting this thing to get around getting a warrant by going out to purchase data, they've experimented. And the Congress has no idea what kind of experiments are happening within our government agencies. We're far away from the culture that we had about 50 years ago when the Church Committee exposed what the CIA, the FBI, the NSA, and all these other agencies were doing to expose domestic surveillance of anti-war and left-wing activists, etc. And we just don't have people in Congress who believe that there are those in these agencies who are going to just consistently abuse their power and flout what is authorized. And I think some of that has to do with the topsy-turvy nature of our politics. Ever since Donald Trump, Democrats have internalized this idea that they need to stand up for the FBI and the CIA and the Director of National Intelligence and all these other security agencies against Trump and Republicans and others who attack the integrity of people who work in these institutions. And while this isn't part of our conversation, that was on display today in the Twitter Files hearing where Matt Taibbi was testifying about the censorship industrial complex. You have Democrats who are making it a part of their identity to defend censorship of people, whether it be on the left or the right. And I think that that truly makes it impossible to do oversight of our security state.
Yeah, no, I think that's such a good point, and I'm trying to remember who this was. I think it was like Dick Durbin many years ago was saying how the information on the Iraq War, how he was like doubting it at the time, but because he was a member of the Intelligence Committee and he had sworn to keep it secret, which you of course have to do, he just like did not come out and say it. I wish I could remember the whole context of the story, but it does really just show how it feels that something has been, just carved out, as it were, for the national security state, since they set it up in 1947, the sort of Cold War nature of it, where this official enemies kind of policy, and I think this is sort of what you're speaking to with Trump and how it all played out, is really the thing that is backing this, that because there are all these sinister enemies that are out there, we have to do little carve-outs in our democracy, which I think makes these pressure campaigns around Russia, around China, around whoever, particularly dangerous, not just because of wars abroad, but because of how it turns inward.
Yeah. Look, we're almost at the 20th anniversary of the Iraq War, and I have flashbacks to the way in which President George W. Bush or Dick Cheney would have talked about threats and the way that they justified the expansion of surveillance when it came to the war on terrorism. And so now we've lost the paradigm. We're no longer in the global war on terrorism paradigm. The paradigm now is that we have to counter Russia, or we have to counter Iran or China, these great powers, or you're hearing about cyber threats, or you have something that I think I might actually share a bit of commonality with people who are on the right wing for just a fleeting moment, not too long. Don't get too confident in yourselves, right-wing libertarians, but just the idea that we need government agencies to help us understand what is factually incorrect or factually correct, to sift through information, to police the data stream that is coming across our feeds on social media, and to manage threats to our country by basically determining what is acceptable discourse, what we can share about foreign policy or about domestic affairs. And I think it's truly troubling that we've seen everything develop into this basically, you're seeing that these programs find a way of rehabilitating themselves or finding new purposes as they lose earlier purposes, right? So you can't really get people afraid of Al-Qaeda anymore because Osama bin Laden doesn't exist and these figureheads are gone. We don't hear about an ISIS threat. But they can repurpose these programs and find other reasons why they have to be reauthorized. So this ritual where they reauthorize the FISA Amendments Act provision every few years actually renews the support for it to continue. I mean, on one hand, you could say, quit doing this if you're going to keep reauthorizing it. But I think this is a ritual that makes people have to show their devotion to the security state and prove that they still believe that it can function. And so that's why we see it keep happening again. And the last thing I'll close with here is to say that people should know the history of the FISA Amendments Act comes out of a response to the exposure of warrantless wiretapping by President George W. Bush. And you might remember that President Barack Obama said he was going to challenge and fight this and he wasn't going to vote for it. And then he abruptly voted for the FISA Amendments Act and then went on to be one of the worst presidents when it came to civil liberties and human rights. And I think the history of this country, just continuing the Bush program wholesale.
Shadowproof.com, thedissenter.org, the podcast Unauthorized Disclosure, all places you can find Kevin Gostela and all sorts of great content from him and others. Kevin, as always, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow, you guys are spying on us still. I mean,
wow. I mean, and it's definitely it's worse than people think. There's a long list, like when they capture your data, allegedly, only people abroad, but they capture all this, millions and millions of records. There's a whole long list of what they can keep based on like what other, security and law enforcement agencies or whatever would want to look at. And, the FBI. So you have to go to the FISA court to investigate someone. But if you want to just search the database to see if you should investigate someone, you do not, in fact, actually have to have a warrant, even from the rubber stamp FISA court. So, I mean, it's an amazing system. And as Kevin pointed out, there are numerous reports from the FISA court itself, from the Inspector General, basically saying that they're rampantly abusing the program all the time. But nonetheless, that never enters into any of the conversation.
And I do appreciate that he laid out the danger it poses to journalists, and trying to keep your sources protected, and also there's just so many different avenues of abuse here. That it's shocking this is still happening now, and there's zero outrage about it at all. Nobody, there was a period of time, it was kind of the peak of it was the Edward Snowden period, where this was talked about constantly, but now it's never in the news. And if it is, it's just given a stamp of approval. It's no big deal. It's something that has to continue to be done, and it's written in really boring language that you're just what, FISA, what? 702, what? Okay, your eyes glaze over and you move on.
Yeah, well, I think that's probably what they're looking for. But talking about sources and methods, of course, the biggest story in the sort of Ukraine war saga situation has been Seymour Hersh's article from a few weeks ago now saying that the U.S. did it, blowing up the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. There's all sorts of theories that are out there. The New York Times aired out their own, well, it's not their theory, the so-called U.S. government theory, that just a random group of Ukrainians took a boat into the Baltic Sea, and that not only did they take a boat out into the Baltic Sea, but that they had a huge amount of explosives, that they are experienced divers, and that they understood exactly how to sabotage the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, but they're completely random. They have no idea, the U.S. government, exactly what they could be doing. I think they actually said they had low confidence. So you really couldn't have a more ridiculous theory, bottom of the barrel, File 13 type of thing. But now, of course, this is being put out there. Basically, it seems like competition with the Seymour Hersh piece. But before we get to that, I just want to play a couple of clips here to remind people, in a way, the context by which many people believe the U.S. was responsible. The first one here is President Biden being asked about what the U.S. would do vis-a-vis Nord Stream.
Let me answer the first question first. If Russia invades, that means tanks or troops crossing the border of Ukraine again. Then there will be no longer a Nord Stream 2. We will bring an end to it.
How will you do that exactly? Since the project and control of the project is within Germany's control.
We will. I promise you we'll be able to do it.
Okay, well...
He promised.
He promised.
He promised. And if we know something about Joe Biden, he keeps his promises. I don't know, actually, if he keeps his promises, but he seemed to keep this one.
Victoria Nuland, the regime change expert of successive U.S. administrations, had this to say in front of Congress after the Nord Stream 2 pipeline was sabotaged.
I've introduced legislation to make Nord Stream 2 sanctions permanent. In your judgment, do you believe sanctions on Nord Stream 2 should be permanent, or should the pipeline be allowed to be turned on?
Senator, I think Nord Stream 2 is now dead, and as you have said, it is a hunk of metal at the bottom of the sea. I don't think it will ever be revived.
So you don't think it will? So let me...
Hunk of metal at the bottom of the sea. So you hear that from the president himself that they were going to take out Nord Stream 2. I mean, he just said it right out. And then, the number one regime change specialist who was giving out cookies in the Maidan Square in 2014, Victoria Nuland, say in response to Senator Ted Cruz that it's dead and she's happy it's a hunk of metal at the bottom of the sea. I mean, what seems more believable to you, Ron? Yes, Seymour Hersh's story that the U.S. and Norway collaborated, or that some random group of Ukrainians launched this attack?
I was looking for this because there's a specific quote from the New York Times article that I'd like to read very quickly before I answer your question of what my opinion is, Eugene. And here it is. You ready? This is the story the New York Times reported. They add, U.S. officials declined to disclose the nature of the intelligence, how it was obtained, or any details of the strength of the evidence it contains. So, I mean, here you have a story written based off of a leak. Was it leak? I'm not even sure. It was like an intelligence report. It wasn't clear.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like someone just came to them and was like, hey, here's the story. So I'm assuming it was from somebody in one of these agencies, coming to some reporter.
And also for the New York Times to write this story and not once mention the story Seymour Hersh wrote. I mean, you can mention it and say
I think they
you
did
don't-
mention it in one sentence.
Oh, they initially
Yeah.
hadn't because people were
did-
saying, "How
they
could
did
you
add
not?"
it, I think, one thing. But
Okay, well-
they shaded it.
what did they
didn't give
say?
it-
Did they
It
say-
was just like Seymour Hersh on the something Substack said something America. It was like one sentence.
Okay, well, I hadn't seen that initially, so maybe this was added after, or maybe I missed it in my haste of getting to like why this story is wrong. But the point is that look, you have a journalist, Seymour Hersh, that has an extensive, established career of exposing many government cover-ups and lies. That he actually won him a Pulitzer Prize in 1970 at one point. Abu Ghraib scandal. He also, like so many other things, that stuff on Syria, stuff on just U.S. Middle East wars, stuff on domestic spying, the CIA spying on anti-war activists, and on and on and on. And so when someone like this, not some random person, but this kind of person, writes an article like he did about Nord Stream based on his sourcing, you take that seriously. As opposed to the New York Times, which has the New York Times broken stories, sure. Also has a well-established record of lying about intelligence and also being a mouthpiece for the U.S. intelligence agencies to get out what they want to the public to frame their own narratives. So what I'm saying here is, my opinion is the New York Times is the story of the New York Times. See, it also just sounds implausible.
Yeah.
I mean, this is a serious thing to do, to be able to plant explosives, divers in the sea. This isn't just like, oh, I'm going snorkeling. This is like, you got to go deep.
Bottom of the
You
Baltic
got to be
Sea.
an experienced, well-trained diver. You're telling me a random group of Ukrainians happens to have well-trained, experienced divers who can go all the way to the bottom of the seafloor and like plant, where do they get the explosives from? And then remotely detonate them at a later date? Even the U.S., even people in the U.S., I think, had said that this had the hallmarks of state-sponsored.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I agree with you. I mean, it's totally unbelievable. I mean, if you told me that the Ukrainian government was behind it, that would actually be more believable.
Right.
But then again, they would have to have gotten out there, they got
Have
the
some
ship.
help.
I
They'd
mean,
have to have some
it would
help.
be very difficult to do this, I think, without being detected, unless you either had help on the front end or you knew they would help you cover it up on the back end, or both. But to me, it seems like what Mr. Hersh has written and what I think most people have surmised is right. I mean, it seems. I mean, we look at what Biden said. We'll see what happens here in Germany. Savim Dagdalin, a minister of parliament there in the Bundestag from Die Linke, has said that this is an act of terrorism, that it needs to be investigated. Her party, Die Linke, has submitted a bill demanding from the government some statements. The SPD, one of the larger parties in Germany, the Social Democratic Party, also has submitted a statement. The AfD, execrable far-right party, but nonetheless has also submitted their own statement. So, Sweden allegedly has investigated the thing, but they're keeping it secret. So it'll be interesting to see. I think most of the media I've been reading in Germany, it'll be difficult for Olaf Scholz to cover this one up, I actually do believe. I mean, let's see what they do. But it seems that if it comes out that the U.S. did it, this would be a big, big game changer in the politics of Germany, where right now a very significant number of people want to see a move towards peace negotiations there. It's one of the biggest topics in the country right now. There's a lot of back and forth going on around this issue. And this potentially could be really a clincher in shifting things in Europe. But we shall see. Obviously, they're going to do their absolute best to cover it up. Obviously, Olaf Scholz is just like, I don't even know, is he an American agent in Germany, destroying his own economy for America?
For what?
It's unbelievable. And Ursula von der Leyen in America today doing more damage to destroy the European economy on behalf of America.
Her ancestors were plantation owners in Virginia, by the way.
I can't say I'm surprised about that.
Slave owners.
She wanted to send more troops to Africa when
Was it
she was
South
German
Carolina?
defense minister. I don't know.
I don't want to get that fact wrong, but her ancestors definitely were plantation owners. Anyway,
Yeah, well, it's unbelievable.
go read her
quite
Wikipedia
frankly.
page. It's actually kind of shocking, the
Yeah.
background of this woman.
Well, it's all about China, what they're talking about here now, and trying to, I don't know. If you're in Europe and you're watching this, you got to do something. I mean, your country's not mine, but I mean, wow, unbelievable.
Go get in the streets, you guys. I mean, they are actually, as we covered last week.
Indeed. Shout out to the Morning Star newspaper for helping us with that. Yes. Well, let's shift gears here. Well, I don't know. We're not really shifting gears in a big way. Back to the issue of censorship, and this one right here in the good old U.S. of A. Our friends at Black Power Media facing some censorship from YouTube. Very happy to be joined, as we always are, by Dr. Jared Ball, who's a professor of communication studies at Morgan State University and the author of The Myth and Propaganda of Black Buying Power, and of course, one of the mainstay pillars of Black Power Media. Jared, thanks so much for being with us.
It's a pleasure. Thanks to you both and your whole crew for having me.
Well, really happy to have you here. And maybe for those who haven't heard, just explain what happened to you guys that you ended up getting censored on YouTube.
Well, like most people who get censored on YouTube, the short answer is we don't know. The description of our infraction was vague at best and is apparently related to election misinformation. But what exactly was said, what time it was said, who said it, is not really very clear. So we've just had to basically do what all people have to do is end up speculating, which I think is part of this sort of psychological warfare effect of all of this. So, yeah, you know.
Yeah, it is really frustrating when it comes to YouTube in terms of, I know that people don't typically get like a reason and then you don't have like a person you can contact. Like what exactly, tell us what happened. Like what's your speculation here? Because I mean, I assume you're assuming, oh, maybe it was this, maybe it was this. And then what exactly was the communication that you had from YouTube? And what are the restrictions now that you're under?
So the announcement was just that we had a video removed, the Remix Morning Show from I think Thursday, now a week or more ago, and then it just said misinformation in one communique, and then another one it expanded that to election misinformation, and then it just says, hey, look at the community guidelines that we've linked you to. And then if you do that, and it just says what I thought was most interesting is that it does say that anything you say critical of any U.S. presidential election is considered an infraction. Anything you say about the last 3 federal elections in Germany is likely to get you caught, right? And then one of the last, I believe, not even the most recent one, but I want to say one of the more recent Brazilian elections. And then it does say at the bottom, this is not an extensive list. So now it doesn't,
Wow.
you know, so and then as we asked, I mean, it doesn't specify the difference between misinformation, criticism, reporting, speculation, analysis, you know, so I even was trying to, and then of course, when you're asked to appeal or told you're allowed to appeal, you're not able to review any transcript or any video because they've already removed it. And you're only able to, the comment section is literally less than a tweet in terms of character space. So all I could really say was, we want to appeal, you know, you know, there's no, you can't outline an argument or lay out anything. And then of course they got back to us, almost by the end of the week-long initial ban, to tell us, oh, we reviewed it and it's going to stand. So then initially all that means is for 7 days, we couldn't post to YouTube, we couldn't comment, we couldn't do anything. We couldn't even post to any related channels under threat that all of them would be taken away. And then, then we're told for 90 days, if there's not another infraction, the strike goes away. If there is a second strike in that 90 days, you get a 2-week ban. And then if there's a third strike in that 90 days, your channel is completely removed permanently. But again, if you don't know what you've said and you don't know exactly what the issue is, and you've had no chance to engage or have any direct back and forth, it's hard to know. So the assumption is we're just on borrowed time. As to why this happened, you know, I was wondering what I would want to say on your platform, because I don't, it's one thing to speculate. It's another to speculate on your platform. I mean, and just drag my wild speculations, because we really don't know. There's some funky timing with some back and forth with some prominent white left activist podcasters that might have done it. There's our general political, approach. And then, of course, there is this vague reference that someone may have made to an election. So, but honestly, I really don't know. And I guess on some level, we take it as a little bit of a badge of honor, although it is frustrating. But ultimately, it's indicative of where we are. I mean, it's a monopoly over communication. It's the silencing of dissent, an age-old problem. So it's just the new form that we have to deal with.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, and interestingly enough, Black Power Media not invited to testify in front of Congress today on the issue of this exact issue. Matt Taibbi, I know, made a statement, but really the exact issue that we've been talking more and more about, I think in this country for the past few years, which, I mean, just the nature of these privately controlled platforms. I mean, to me, like the very vagueness of it, the inability to really do anything just speaks to the broader issue that we've all become relatively reliant on this handful of social media giants and these, 8,000 page terms of services that, govern everything, and they can manipulate it however they want. I mean, obviously I'm not against YouTube. Here we are on YouTube, but it does feel like the propaganda power, and maybe I'm wrong. Maybe it was exactly the same when it was just a handful of newspapers, but it almost feels like this is even a more pernicious thing because it's taken the promise of sort of quote unquote citizen journalism and really shunted it, into this box of fear because you'll be shut down.
So forgive this if it's not a perfect comparison or parallel, but I just happened to have, because for what we're trying to do on tomorrow's program, we were looking at the recent interview and discussion between Kathy Hughes, that some may remember is the sort of queen of Black commercial media, and the head of Radio One and Syndication One and TV One, et cetera, and so forth, and Questlove, the drummer of The Roots, on his podcast. And they had this sort of rebranding of the history of the Black bourgeoisie and the Black business class and their engagement with the media and journalism space. And part of what they were doing is, I think, sort of rebranding and trying to negate the history of people like Glenn Ford, the late great Glenn Ford, and many other journalists who for a long time were trying to point out that when we're trying to get out community activist news and journalism, when we're trying to convey messages to our own community and our own audiences, it's an entire apparatus of commercial media, of capital, of venture capital and marketing and advertising that almost, to the extent that that conversation was seen by some of us as a negation of our work, negates even the issue of gender or race or even class of the owner, in the sense that the owner of commercial media is beholden to advertising, the corporate elite's interests, political interests, et cetera, and so forth. But the point I'm getting at is that as they're having this conversation, which was rebranding this woman and her efforts in with Radio One as some sort of revolutionary engagement into the space, looking to preserve much needed space, even in today's, plush, marketplace with media, that it's important to remember that the traditions of Black owned radio and Black business. Meanwhile, I went back and I'm digging out the work of Glenn Ford and others, and they're saying it don't matter the color or the gender or the sexual orientation of the owner if they're beholden and following the lead of advertisers marketing, which is of course dominated by the most elite corporations, military, defense, et cetera, and so forth, which erases news, as she did with her own Radio One outlet, which makes uniform musical playlists and sanitizes music and sanitizes communication, and yet is being presented in today's world as some sort of historical reminder of the importance of these spaces, when today they're more important than ever, if in fact they were real, that is an alternative, which we don't really have. So the problems that we faced under the old regime of media and the media environment has just been enhanced and made worse in this new form, where once upon a time you could go and protest the Kathy Hughes radio station and maybe even force them to hear you. Here, there is no Google overlord that is beholden or interested in hearing you. And at best, you might get sort of a bot-like response that is vague and empty. And instead of us being encouraged to actual traditions that I think you all emulate very well, of grassroots community activist-based journalism, we're getting new rebrandings of of old world problems as once being revolutionary and preparing us for today. And all that to say, it's a very complicated and wild moment that we're in. So I'm very happy that you all are doing your work. And I want to say very publicly, because I'm a little bit of a hater here. I've been looking at who hasn't been supportive and showing some solidarity. And it's a little funky out here in these YouTube streets with folks trying to do media and people who, claim some levels of solidarity and interest with you, maybe privately. But when you end up in a little bit of a situation, they seem to be hard to find and hard to hear from. So anyway, thanks to you for that as well.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think it's really important what you're getting at here, because you also have companies like Google and Twitter at the same time having these like diversity departments or like diversity.
Yeah, diversity, equity, inclusion.
Thank you.
Equity,
Whatever
inclusion,
that
that's
means.
right. Yep.
Yeah. So like at the same time that like the media space is becoming so hostile to alternative media of color, and like non-corporate media in general, you also at the same time have this parallel of like shallow surface level, like, oh, but like we have like an LGBT person and a black person and a brown person and all of these positions to make sure that everybody's included. But at the end of the day, that just doesn't mean anything. And it's quite frustrating. It's more of a comment for me. I'm just like, I just find it funny that we don't know who the Google overlords are. And at the same time, they're also collaborating with U.S. government agencies and with all of these think tanks that are basically telling them that outlets like that have opinions like we do are basically spreading misinformation and should be suppressed or in some cases censored.
I mean, that is the other part. I mean, imagine that. I mean, think about all the madness that is out here on YouTube and the idea that any sort of criticism of the U.S. election is somehow misinformation. I mean, it feels very targeted. It feels very specific and less than arbitrary. So, like it seems very much specific but when Larry Fink at BlackRock is telling people, if you want our money to invest in your companies, you have to have a good, I don't think he calls it exactly a DEI score, but it's something equivalent to that. It's some sort of social justice ecosystem score that he wants he wants companies that want his money and BlackRock's investment to promote themselves as being diverse, equitable, and inclusive, when in fact, obviously, that's not the case. And I did hear from a colleague of mine in the academic world who did say that he sort of rebranded himself out of traditional academia and into university DEI spaces, because that's where funding and job advancement is, as opposed to traditional faculty, professorships, et cetera, and so forth. So it's like I said, it's a as I think was once coined famously, a brave new world and an exciting one at that, right?
No, I hear you 100%, and there's so much that we could touch on. I think you already sort of touched on it. I'll just take one step further into controversy here. I mean, we've had a similar conversation, you and I, Jared, regarding, who stepped up and who didn't step up around Black Power media, around the issue of Black political prisoners. Obviously all of us here would like to see Julian Assange be freed right away. But, you see a lot of the people who are movement behind that, nothing to say about Mumia Abu-Jamal, for instance, or Leonard Peltier or others like that. And I just, it feels almost like so much of the conversation around sort of the criticism of, this quote unquote deep state and the depredations of so many of these things since the Trump era has become so straitjacketed into this like white right wing thing. And it's like you've got the Twitter files all over the place, Bari Weiss, all these other people, Matt Taibbi or whatever, and no conversation, for instance, about the many people from the Horn of Africa who lost their accounts, in the context of the U.S.-backed war in Ethiopia. Nothing about that. But if some random right-wing person at some point was, slightly, put down in the algorithm, it's in front of Congress now, and it's being promoted by one of the major political parties. And I guess there's probably always been a double standard, if not a triple or a quadruple standard against Black radicals in this country. But it just does seem glaring to me, yet again, in seeing what's happening, that I only know about this because I follow Black Power media.
Well, I mean, I do think it's important, and we just happened to deal with this in my class, one of my classes today, that the counterintelligence program, it is important to remember that there were specific tactics used and directed at Black people, but the goal ultimately was to direct themselves, that is the state's attention, to all manner of genuine radicalism and to destroy it and upset it. So that's why I think one reason why I think today we see so many being re-invited to the right under the guise of populism, with this idea that if I can get in front of Tucker Carlson and if I can get on a podium with Ron Paul, that this is somehow, going to expand the cause of progressives, as opposed to what we often don't see, to I think a similar point that you're making. We don't see those same overtures to the people on their left. Why not build with me? Why not build with us? Why is the rush? There's more of us numerically in terms of world majority people, poor people, women, etc., who are oppressed, who find themselves needing a news and media outlet, unlike, I would say, a Tucker Carlson and Fox News. And yet so many want to recast themselves as radical by heading in that direction with this idea that this is a good thing for the benefit of society, and it's sort of a mature move towards a populism. And that means you can't deal with political prisoners that are not Julian Assange to the extent that they even deal with him. I mean, to be fair, I don't even think he gets enough attention from those who would claim that he's their main focus. So certainly people like Mumia, who are, or Leonard Peltier, or who are reminiscent of movements that these folks are either not comfortable with or unfamiliar with, and are not certainly welcome to discuss when they move to Fox News and Tucker Carlson and podiums with Ron Paul. It just makes sense. There's just the simple adage is always there's more money on the right than on the left. And it's still a tantalizing invitation. So between Larry Fink and Tucker Carlson and other big podcasts and platforms, there's a lot of, again, invitation for people to walk away from politics that are maybe the most appropriate, but the least fruitful in terms of platforming, access, and of course, money. So.
Mm-hmm. Well, speaking of money, where can people go to make a donation to Black Power Media and follow your work? Because I think, as was famously said by Jay Prince, we gonna sell it out the Ghetto Boys album. Just look inside the liner notes of the Ghetto Boys album. Real gangsters wear ghetto prisoners gear. Okay, that's a shout out to the Ghetto Boys. But we want to support you. We want other people to support you. So where can they go to do so?
Now Eugene is just showing off all this depth of knowledge and wisdom, and now you're going to quote Jay Prince and throw it in our face like that. That's shame on you, Eugene. Shame. No, blackpowermedia.org is the simple one-stop spot to support the platform. Blackpowermedia.org. Thank you all very much for, again, I really appreciate the work you all do at Breakthrough, and then for having us on is really important. So thank you very much. It's always a pleasure.
Mm-hmm. No, the pleasure is all ours, and thank you, Jared. I appreciate it. And if you're out there, go make a donation, blackpowermedia.org. Well, unbelievable. I mean, you can't even talk about the Electoral College now, apparently. Who knows? Probably somebody was watching the account and they, saw that this is a great opportunity to hit them, something to always be aware of. And I don't know, whoever from YouTube is watching us.
Hey, guys. Hopefully it's the Diversity and Inclusion Equity Office, or what's that called?
Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion.
There it is.
Hopefully, you revisit your internal policies. That's all I can say.
Really.
Well, let's keep it moving here, and let's move to the... Oh, shout out to, sorry, I do not know exactly how to say that, but you donated $50, so shout out to you, Maul, for that real big support. Appreciate you. Let's shift gears here to the war machine and the warmongers, and we are very happy to be joined here by Amanda Yee, an editor of Liberation News.
Hey, how are you?
Doing very well. Thank you. Very happy to have you on. And there are many, many things that I'm sure we could talk about here, but you had a recent article at Liberation News, 6 warmongering think tanks and the military contractors that fund them. I love that name, I have to say. But I guess maybe my first question is a little bit more sort of prosaic here is talk a little bit, if you could, about what is the role of think tanks in the sort of ideological formation process when we're looking at these warlike policies?
Yeah, for sure. I think we need to understand the central role that think tanks and these policy institutes play in creating foreign policy, right? These think tanks are sources of expertise for US policymakers in that they produce reports and analysis which influence national security priorities and legislation, and also sources of like expertise for House intelligence committees, like top officials from think tanks like the Atlantic Council and the Hudson Institute have been called upon to recommend areas of focus. But in addition to that, these think tanks often send representatives to provide expertise in public opinion in places like CNN, MSNBC, to write op-eds in corporate media outlets like the New York Times. They often give interviews to those same corporate media outlets as a source of expertise on foreign policy. So not only do these think tanks shape the way that not only do they shape U.S. foreign policy and national security priorities, but they also do the very important work of shaping public opinion around and support and consent for U.S. foreign policy objectives.
And what's so amazing is obviously the funding stream, right? Like it's all weapons companies. Literally, like you look through this list that you made, and it's all the same weapons companies. In each case, actually, many of the same ones. Go ahead.
Yeah. I was reading a report from the Institute for Policy Studies, and they did an analysis from like 2014 to 2019. And they found that defense contractors, along with the US government, they contributed something like $1 billion to the top 50 most influential think tanks. Wow. So the top think tanks that contributed, the top donors, were very familiar names. You might recognize them: Northrop Grumman, Raytheon, Boeing, Lockheed Martin, Airbus. So this is a staggering amount of money that these military contractors have at their disposal, right? This influence, the influence of this source of funding really can't be overstated. It literally steers the US foreign policy agenda. Just one example that I want to point out, one of the think tanks that I mentioned in the article that I wrote was the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. And ASPI has been one of the primary peddlers of this Uyghur genocide narrative in the past few years. They were instrumental in producing reports that shaped public perception around Xinjiang. They were constantly cited in places like the New York Times. At one point they were literally everywhere talking about what was going on in Xinjiang. But if you pull up their annual report, the core of their funding comes from the Australian Department of Defense. It comes from U.S. agencies like the U.S. State Department, the U.S. Department of Defense, along with hundreds of thousands of dollars from defense companies like Thales Australia, Saab, Lockheed Martin, and Boeing. So there's a lot of money to be made in all of this.
And it's almost like a way to launder, like for Western governments to launder their ideology through these other places that then donate to these other places. I mean, it's just this big circle. And I think it's also important, and again, I'm just really commenting here, and I'd love to hear you add to it. But in terms of the way it plays out in the media, I mean, basically, so you have all these weapons companies, and in some cases, actually government-funded think tanks, right? Which is a fun word. Who came up with the word think tank itself, right? Because they don't do much thinking. But these think tanks that launder basically imperialism, and they produce these seemingly academic reports that aren't really academic at all, just by a bunch of paid mercenaries, basically, to just say what the Pentagon already wants and what all of these different governments already want. In this case, ramp up the Cold War against China. And then it's interesting because all of that gets filtered through the U.S. corporate media that then treats these reports as if they're saying something interesting. And I think the Xinjiang issue is important to note there because so much of that came from think tank reports that then the New York Times would be explosive story, but you never hear what's being funded and then what's the agenda behind that.
Right. Defense is a huge industry. When I say defense, I don't just mean the manufacturing of weapons, even though that's a huge part of it too. I'm talking about, companies like Rolls-Royce, which provide military airplane engines, companies providing cloud services or information technology services like Oracle. I'm talking about like telecoms companies like AT&T, which provide satellites and other kinds of technology to assist in intelligence gathering. And some of these companies are also in the business of producing intelligence analysis for the CIA, like Lockheed Martin, BAE Systems. So that means they're in this really unique position where they're contracted out to provide intelligence analysis for the CIA. And of course, they're going to produce intelligence reports that raise the alarm on enemy nations like Russia and China so that their company can sell more military equipment. That's a huge conflict of interest, right? And these donations that these military contractors provide to these think tanks, it's considered an investment because war is such a huge profit-making industry. And these companies, they spend millions of dollars in funding toward think tanks, raising the alarm on places like Russia and China. And not only that, but they spend millions of dollars a year in political lobbying to ensure that legislators vote for their pro-war agenda. And this is why the US is always in this constant state of war, right? And this is why we're constantly inundated with this kind of propaganda around the threat of China. This is why the US is sending billions of dollars in weapons to Ukraine, just sending Ukrainians to die in order to prolong this unwinnable proxy war against Russia. Because the purpose of this war is not to win. The purpose is to prolong the war as long as possible, to deliver as much profit as possible to these military contractors for as long as they can, regardless of the human cost.
No, I mean, it seems like there's such an amazing double standard at play as well. I mean, if you even just get on social media and put something out that's pushing back against the war narrative, you must be, Putin propaganda, you're paid by Russia, you're paid by China. I mean, we're even at the point where they're in Texas trying to ban Chinese people, including people with legal citizenship status, from, buying land in the country because somehow, that's some nefarious plot or whatever. Someone wants to buy a house in the Houston suburbs. But the same propaganda apparatus is never operated in the same way. I mean, it's often not even disclosed. And I mean, I don't know, maybe almost never, it seems. Like I see these people talking heads all over TV, and you would never know this. There's never any like this person in the New York Times, someone from CSIS, also funded by Boeing. But if you have even like, 18 cousins removed, somebody who lives in Moscow, then it's like, with ties to Russia. It's just amazing on that level.
Yeah, I mean, I think what's really remarkable and what people really don't understand is the very close relationship between government institutions, think tanks, and these military contractors. Like the government's ties to the defense industry are so deep that top executives at these defense companies often encourage their employees to think of themselves as extensions of the US government. Just to provide one example, the head of the Pentagon under Biden, Lloyd Austin, served on Raytheon's board of directors before his appointment. Before he was appointed, another person in the running for that position was Michelle Flournoy, and she served on the board of Booz Allen Hamilton, which is another major military contractor. And now she's the current defense policy advisor under Biden. And these military contractors, they also work together with think tanks like the Center for Strategic and International Studies. And they organize conferences attended by national security officials, so government employees, where the defense companies will bid for government contracts. And also like a really important thing to keep in mind is that since the end of the Cold War, more and more of this kind of intelligence analysis, CIA and the NSA have been contracted out to a lot of these defense contractors, like I said earlier. Like after the end of the Cold War, the government really slashed a lot of staff at the CIA and NSA because they didn't see a need for these bloated intelligence bureaucracies anymore. And what intelligence analysis they needed, they ended up contracting out. And then, of course, after 9/11, the US government saw a need for more intelligence, but by that time, the most experienced were at these defense companies. So increasingly, the work of intelligence analysis and intelligence reports have been contracted out to these same defense companies.
You know, Amanda, one thing that I think a lot of people are thinking about these days, and of course, you know, we've already seen the reporting that the next defense budget will be yet again the largest in the history of the United States. I feel like I've heard that for the past 10 or 15 years. Yeah. I mean, the expanding, you know, intelligence element of the military-industrial complex that you just mentioned. I mean, what sort of pushback are we seeing in the broader U.S. populace, and what are people saying out there about what can be done? Because it really does feel, you know, you compare it to what we're seeing with the collapsing infrastructure in this country, you know, a runaway train that's really, really pulling down the America and the world.
Yeah, I mean, I think with the Russian invasion of Ukraine last year, I think people are getting more and more tired of war. And it's becoming more and more clear to us that this drive for greater and greater profit by these corporations is pushing us closer and closer toward a global catastrophe. You know, like war is driven by capitalism. Capitalism is the origin of this US policy of never-ending military conflict and imperialist domination. And I think people are really starting to understand that, and we really do need to understand that. And because of what's at stake here, it's really imperative more than ever to, you know, build a really powerful anti-war movement, which is capable of confronting this US war machine. And the only way we can do that is through uniting the multinational working class into this anti-capitalist, anti-imperialist coalition, right? I mean, I think that's the only way we can even hope to confront this military system of death and destruction. And so, you know, that's why we, along with 200 other organizations, we're sponsoring a national protest on March 18th in Washington, D.C. That's one way that we can push back against this, you know, ever increasing Pentagon budget. March 18th is significant because it's the 20th anniversary of the U.S. invasion of Iraq. And so, you know, we're marching that day to demand an end to all U.S. wars. So this means an end to U.S. proxy war in Ukraine. This means an end to the dangerous Cold War with China, ending all U.S. military aid to Israel. It means ending, making the demands to end U.S. economic warfare and its sanctions regime against places like Cuba, Venezuela, and Syria. And of course, we're also calling for abolishing these imperialist tools of U.S. warfare, which includes like NATO and AFRICOM, of course. So, you know, we know that people are tired of war, especially when so many people are struggling to make ends meet. And so many programs here continue to go underfunded. So I think one way that people can push back is to join us on Saturday, March 18th at 1 p.m. in front of the White House.
Mm-hmm. Amanda Yee, editor of Liberation News. Thank you so much for joining us here on the Freedom Side.
Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm. Also has a great podcast, Radio Free Amanda. Just want to plug that, become a patron of that. We're telling we're spreading the wealth here. Yeah. But nonetheless, very important issue. I really hope people check out that article on Liberation News. Very, very interesting. 6 warmongering think tanks and the military contractors that fund them. Eye-opening about some of the names you see on a regular basis in the mainstream media, as it were. But as always, Rania,
as always, except wait. Different than always.
Different than always.
Because we're in person.
So the same but different. This brings us to the end of our show.
Hang on. Just a reminder, we are in the same table, on the same table.
Yes. Thank you to the Breakthrough News team for your great CGI for
no, it's my
fake,
hand. It's
fake
my
thing.
hand. Look, I have these freckles. No one cares.
I'll tell you what, if you become a patron, we'll tell you whether it was real or CGI.
I already told them it was real.
Well, go to patreon.com/breakthrough-news if you don't believe Rania and become a patron, and we will let you know if she's lying or telling the truth.
Or become a patron so next time I'm in person, we can have a wide shot so that we can prove I'm here.
Or just become a patron because you like what we're doing here at Breakthrough News. How about that?
Okay, fine.
Patreon.com/breakthrough-news, patreon.com/breakthrough-news. That's where you can go to support us. Don't forget to support our good friends at Black Power Media as well, who are under attack. But as always, for us here on the Freedom Side, we will see you next time. Revolution,
We did it, Joe. We did it,